Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today at the Transforming Shorelines Collaborative webinar on regulatory pathways for nature-based solutions for shoreline resilience in the Bay Area. It's great to have you all here, and we have a really exciting agenda for you today. My name is Sasha Harris-Levitt. I'm the lead environmental scientist at the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. And I can tell you a little bit about the Transforming Shorelines Collaborative if you're new here. The idea is really to build regional capacity for nature-based solutions for shoreline resilience. And so we have different meetings, webinars, workshops that help us get together, share information, learn from each other, strategize, and really advance NBS, nature-based solutions, which we call NBS projects throughout the region. So we're particularly working on advancing multi-benefit nature-based projects that involve water quality improvement and public access, in addition to shoreline resilience and provision of habitat. So I'll start with a land acknowledgement. The San Francisco Bay is the unceded ancestral territory of many indigenous groups, including the Himrun Ohlone, Halkin, Saklan tribe, the Confederated villages of Lashan, the Karkin, Muwekma, Ramatish, Tamian, and Yokutz Ohlone, the Coast and Bay Miwok, the Patwin, and the Amamutsan tribal band. The broader San Francisco estuary is also the homeland of the Plains Miwok, Wapo, Winton, and Nisenan people. We benefit from living and working on their traditional homelands, and we wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of these tribal communities, and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we're expecting for today. First, I will turn it over to Heidi Nutters and Jen Siu to talk about a project that they've been working on over the past year or more on regulatory pathways for nature-based solutions. Jill Sunahara from ESA unfortunately won't be able to join us today because she's out sick, but she also participated in that project and helped lead it. And then we'll have a panel discussion with Jackie Zipkin from EBDA, Samantha Engledge from Palo Alto, Agnes Fares from the Water Board, and Harriet Ross from BCDC, all of whom will share their ideas about regulatory pathways for nature-based solutions. So with that, I will turn it over to Heidi Nutters.
Good morning. Great to see everybody here. And thanks for the introduction, Sasha. As Sasha mentioned, this is a project that I worked very closely with Jennifer Siu and Jill Sunahara on. It looks like Jill's on the call, so I'm just checking with her to see how she's feeling, but I know she's a little bit under the weather at the moment. So I'll be giving an overview of the project, and then we'll be turning it over to Jen to talk a little bit more about our recommendations that came out of this effort. Next slide. So okay, I already gave the outline. Next slide. Sorry, let me just open my notes. Okay. So before we dive into this specific project, we kind of wanted to zoom out and give the bigger picture and talk about why. And specifically, the relevant question here is, what do we want our shorelines to look like, and what services will they provide? So everybody that's on the webinar that's speaking or on the panel are people that are deeply immersed in climate adaptation and nature-based solutions work around the San Francisco estuary and are grappling with this question. And this fundamentally is not a regulatory question, but a societal one. So we're grappling with the future of our estuary and the role of green infrastructure in providing critical services to communities given an uncertain future that we're all trying to find a better pathway for together. So there are a myriad of reasons why living shorelines benefit all of us, and we can all be champions for them. So I really like this image that Jen Siu shared with me from NOAA, that talks about the many ways that living shorelines support resilient communities. And as we dive deeper into this work, I sort of wanted to offer it as a framing for kind of like our why are we here, and what's sort of driving the conversation on this topic. Next slide. I also wanted to talk a little bit about sort of some of the big picture key considerations for the use of nature-based solutions, and direct you all to this report, Incorporate Nature-Based Solutions in Community Climate Adaptation Planning. And we've highlighted here some of the, and I think Sasha's going to put the link to this report in the chat, some of the important sort of high-level considerations that drive this, our thinking on nature-based solutions. And again, are the conversations about, permitting and regulatory pathways, are under this, like, these larger framing. So the importance of recognizing natural systems and processes as critical infrastructure, the importance of considering the equity implications in the design and application of NBS. So at the Estuary Partnership, we're really interested in seeking ways to empower communities to lead more and more on climate adaptation on the shoreline and nature-based solutions, ensuring that NBS yields net positive biodiversity benefits. And that's something that really drives our thinking in the regulatory and permitting space as well. Giving the natural features and processes space to function. So really thinking at a larger scale when possible about how we develop nature-based solutions and integrating NBS into existing planning processes and really mainstreaming it as a result of that. Next slide. So the White House Council on Environmental Quality report provides a roadmap with 5 strategic recommendations for federal agencies to unlock the potential of nature-based solutions. The recommendations position the U.S. to prioritize NBS as go-to options in fighting climate change, nature loss, and climate justice inequities. I want to highlight 2 actions pertinent to our discussion today that are on this slide here. Number 1, updating policies. General permits and programmatic reviews have ensured efficient agency review of many types of infrastructure and are ripe for expansion for implementing nature-based solutions. Likewise, updating benefit, cost, and accounting guidance will make the economic benefit of investing in NBS more visible on the nation's balance sheets and in regulatory and funding decisions. And then second, prioritizing research, innovation, knowledge, and adaptive learning. As the world changes, we need to innovate and fill gaps in our understanding of nature-based solutions and when to use them. So agencies are continuing to explore the potential for NBS to further their missions and provide multiple benefits. Next slide. So diving into the Bay and the local context, sort of what's driving nature-based solutions on the ground here where we are located. First of all, the San Francisco Estuary Partnership's Estuary Blueprint provides a suite of actions focused on advancing nature-based solutions, including working with regulatory partners to accelerate, to understand what those pathways could look like, and with implementing partners to accelerate projects on the shoreline. So as we're seeing more of these projects advance, which is incredible for our region, there are some of those drivers for that are listed on the slide here. One of the pieces that I would like to highlight is SB 272, which was passed at the end of 2023, which will require jurisdictions within the Bay and in the outer coast to develop shoreline adaptation plans. And as many of you know and are tracking this, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission will be approving those plans for the San Francisco Bay. And the role of nature-based solutions in that larger adaptation space is a topic of huge conversation and, is really seen as being seen as being critical for the future of those climate adaptation plans. In addition, at the federal level, the federal executive order has had a huge impact on, driving nature-based solutions at the federal level. And we've really seen that trickle down to the state and to the local level as well. Next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the type of projects that we specifically dove into with this particular project, and that is horizontal levees and ecotones. So a horizontal levee, the definition is on the slide here, is an innovative NBS project type, one of many. There's many different projects under the NBS umbrella. And horizontal levees are unique in that it's essentially an ecotone slope that is providing some kind of water quality improvement, whether that is treating wastewater or reverse osmosis concentrate. In some cases, we're exploring the opportunities for stormwater in horizontal levees, and also utilizing treated wastewater to irrigate and help to establish habitat on an ecotone. So when we talk about horizontal levees, that's sort of the distinction. An ecotone is an upland transition zone project type, and a horizontal levee is an ecotone that's incorporating treated wastewater or reverse osmosis concentrate. And one of the really big things that we found in this process is that, we went into this thinking that the input of treated wastewater would be the most difficult part to permit of this project. And we've really found that the water board in particular has really championed horizontal levees, and there are permitting pathways for the water component. And some of the key challenges are really on sort of some of the impacts to sensitive species and near-term versus long-term benefits that we'll get into a lot more moving forward. Next slide. So before Jen kind of dives a little bit into our project and what our findings were, I want to zoom out one more time and talk about the swath of implementation challenges that are central to this work. So regulatory challenges and providing technical support for permittees as well as regulators is critical to this process. But governance challenges are also very high on the list of what sort of barriers to adaptation here, as well as the importance of keeping communities at the center and doing all of this at the pace and scale that sort of achieves our regional, state, and federal objectives on nature-based solutions. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jen Siu to talk us through a little bit of the project and some of our findings.
Thank you so much, Heidi. I am now sick today, so I apologize for my voice, but we will get through it. So I just wanted to outline, why EPA is involved in this. EPA, it essentially wants to advance the San Francisco Estuary Blueprint, and we've funded the Transforming Shorelines work as well as this regulatory pathways project through the San Francisco Water Quality Improvement Fund. Specifically, the project directly supports our achievement of those 4 estuary blueprint goals of habitat and living resources, water quality improvement, resiliency, and stewardship. So regulatory considerations for planning and permitting nature-based shoreline adaptation are challenging and already acknowledged by the agencies such as the Policy Management Committee and Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, who work on Measure AA restoration multi-benefit projects. Next slide, please. So, working in the San Francisco Bay and California in general, it takes a lot of folks. And, this project can only work with a robust advisory team of agencies and organizations at the forefront of tackling, nature-based permitting issues. So those are listed here. And I want to thank those folks for really giving us their time and their feedback. And this is not always a easy conversation, but they really dove in, and I just want to say thank you for that. Next slide. So specific to the regulatory pathways goals, we really were looking to first, provide awareness and vetting of the specific challenges that we're working with, with our diversified project team. So what has already happened in this space to accommodate for nature-based solutions, and then what is yet needs to be done to enable these projects to be successful. We wanted to develop real-world case studies from the Bay as examples to learn from and identify potential solutions in concert with those regulatory partners. Next slide. So based on the outputs from the Transforming Shorelines collaborative work, we dove into this project in 2023. We have several deliverables that we've accomplished, and we'll talk about them specifically in the next few slides. But we have built case studies for 4 nature-based projects around the San Francisco Bay shoreline, Sonoma Creek in the North Bay, Palo Alto in the South Bay, and East Bay projects as well. Those case studies basically are highlighting and exploring specifically the permitting pathways that were considered, what were the challenges with those permitting pathways, and what are some potential steps forward. So we can really learn from these case studies. The regulatory pathways white paper and the call to accelerate the actions memo, those are our main deliverables of this project. And really they're meant to fully outline the drivers, the key advancements, the outstanding challenges, and the potential effective pathways for regulatory accommodation of these nature-based projects. And again, this is right now, we're talking San Francisco Bay. These products that we have are expected to promote discussion amongst all the organizations and agencies and really elevate opportunities to advance nature-based solutions. So like Heidi said, what do we want for our shoreline, really? And how do we get there? So this is a very complex conversation with lots of different levers. So our team has also been providing outreach on the white paper and the project and the accelerations memo to both regulatory and resource agencies at the state and federal level, and to our planning project proponents, as well as other organizations working in the Bay for resiliency. And then a next step would be putting concrete actions and tasks on paper in a work plan. Next slide, please. So the white paper, what were our key findings? As I mentioned, the white paper essentially lays out the findings that NBS is moving at a fast clip. It is moving forward because it can be an effective and preferred method for shoreline resiliencies. And that's happening all over the country. These projects have essentially a lot more, I would say, traction on the East Coast and the South and the Gulf Coast, where they're responding to quite distinct hurricanes and flooding disasters and things like that. So they're a little bit ahead of us, but we're going to get there. And while the regulatory agencies, another finding we found is, yes, we've made some progress on permitting tools, such as the aquatic resource type conversion evaluation framework. Don't let the name fool you. There's a lot of specifics on short-term versus long-term impacts, long-term permitting frameworks, that help with how you analyze a pretty complex project on a lot of different levels. We also have programmatic approaches, the state's cutting the green tape and all the programmatic permits that work with that cutting the green tape initiative. And then we have interagency coordination. Again, I mentioned the PMC and the BRIT from earlier, but we still have challenges. Essentially, what's happened is all the low-hanging restoration projects, whether they be smaller or less complex, they can be handled with these processes, these improved processes that have come through. But really, the highly complex ones that we're looking at today, especially those that require substantive fill into existing wetland habitats, those are a much harder nut to crack, because essentially the Clean Water Act was not written for a changing climate future in which we might have to put fill into wetland habitats to make them more resilient, as well as provide these multi-benefits that Heidi so well laid out. So essentially, yeah, there's further action, particularly in the permitting space, to do. And so that's what the final finding of the white paper is. Next slide, please. We also produced this accelerating actions memo, which is, I think it's 4 pages, which really distills down the main buckets to work on for improving nature-based solution regulatory pathways. It's really like a handout that we could use internally in our own organizations or externally when we're talking to policymakers or funders. It's the hope is that it really can quickly lay out the buckets where work is needed. Funding to engage, particularly for regulatory staff who are always, we're always have staff capacity issues, right? And funding is necessary for them to engage on these issues in a really meaningful and deep dive way, similar to how the PMC and the BRIT do, but even further, to go even further and to do it with extreme technical learning and iterative engagement. So that takes money to allow these staff to really focus on these complexities that are driving our planning and permitting. I seem to have lost my way here. Sorry, folks. Give me a moment, please. So I mentioned that, you know, some of the technical issues, I want to dive down a little bit into what those technical issues are. Really, we have to look at these multi-benefit projects from a broader analysis standpoint than what we typically do. The 404 and the 401, we usually have a very narrow view when we're looking at permitting scope. We are finding we have to broaden that analysis. We have to look at the watershed scale, which we're always trying to do, but watershed scale both in the short term for the next 5-10 years and in the long term, up to a 50-year planning phase. And our regulatory permit vehicles don't typically go that far. They literally are usually up to 10-year permit vehicles. So that really, you know, we have to look at the feasibility of different adaptive monitoring and permitting vehicles. And we also need to look at feasible minimization and avoidance measures in addition to mitigation. I think typically we're jumping straight to mitigation when we're thinking about these projects, and we're trying to sort of right size that a little bit more to really think about, okay, well, let's work iteratively with the knowledge that we do know and we are learning with our project proponents on how to basically fold in the benefits of the habitat aspects so that they serve as the totality of the project description. And we're not mitigating, we're never going to mitigate ourselves out of shoreline resiliency. It's just not going to happen. We know our marshes are drowning at a fast clip for the majority of our marshes. Next slide, please. Oh, I forgot to say that we do have, you know, we have the Clean Water Act 404, 401, and our ESA and CESA, Endangered Species Act for our, you know, special status species. There is inherent flexibility in interpreting those permitting regulations. So we're not calling for a rewrite of the Clean Water Act or ESA. So I just need to make that clear. For the work plan, man, I've lost myself again. I love being sick. Moving forward, our hope is that, you know, we can all the different people, interests and organizations and agencies that are represented here can commit to some sort of collective action to resolve issues in those three buckets of funding, technical engagement, regulatory advancements. If we don't collectively work on this, as we mentioned before, we're just not going to get very far, and we're going to have to work on areas where we have trade-offs and what's acceptable as a society to those trade-offs. So we did start work on the conceptual work plan, but we need to find further willing partners and staff time and money to continue that work. And I think this is my last slide coming up. Next slide, please. So what's great is we have some real-time opportunities, real-time projects that are going forward now that we can cut our collective teeth on to pilot regulatory pathways. And to have that iterative learning and to strengthen our existing regulatory forums, such as the BRIT and the PMC. Basically, State Route 37, huge project, one of many of the infrastructure type projects we're going to be tackling around the Bay Area that need resiliency to flooding and sea level rise. In addition to the railroads, in addition to PG&E infrastructure, all these core infrastructure projects, we don't just want to redo what we've done in the past. We really want to incorporate multi-benefit solutions that will yield goals for the greater good and minimize, the need for compensatory mitigation. If we can do both, we're going to get a win-win. So State Route 37 Caltrans has been really great about finding ways to do pretty strong and large habitat restoration actions associated with State Route 37 along certain parts of that route. So we want to see more of that. We want to push for more of that. And the same thing with EBDA and the Oro Loma First Mile Horizontal Levee Project, which we'll hear more of today from Jackie and others. Really, if what I want to say is, these large scale infrastructure resiliency projects have to provide habitats, have to provide benefits to our habitats, our water quality, and the infrastructure to achieve societal win-wins. So that goes back to the estuary blueprint. Habitat, water quality, stewardship, resiliency. We can have it all. It just might take a little while. And the last thing that I'll say is, Heidi sent me something recently that really was a great paper, and I'm sorry, I'm not I'm butchering her name, but she really laid out that this tension between the amount of regulatory oversight that we provide and the environmental superior outcomes that we want to try to right size our level of regulatory oversight. So we're not unintentionally undercutting these restoration and resiliency efforts, which are generally more costly and more time to plan and certainly permit and construct, but over time are going to yield less costly benefits across the board. So I think that's it for me. Next slide, please. I think Heidi and I can answer questions if you have any. Thank you so much, Heidi. Heidi put a link into that really great and short article. We really encourage you to read it.
All right, well, thank you so much for your presentation, Jen and Heidi, and we will open it up to the audience. If you have questions, why don't you go ahead and raise your hand or come off mute, and we have a few minutes for questions. And if there's no questions, that's okay too. And things come up, feel free to put them in the chat. And we will move over to our panel discussion, and I will turn it over to Heidi.
Thank you all. And if questions arise from the presentation or as we're going through the panel, we encourage you to use the chat to type in your thoughts or your questions, or you can just use the raise hand feature on Zoom so that we can call on you. This next part will be, interactive, and so we definitely encourage your engagement as we move along in the webinar. So we have 4 amazing panelists to sort of dive into these issues deeper, and moving on from what Jen just sort of laid out for us and into the practice. So we have 2 project implementers and 2 regulators that I'd like to introduce you to. Jackie Zipkin, General Manager of the East Bay Discharges Authority, Samantha Engelage, Senior Environmental Engineer at the City of Palo Alto Regional Water Quality Control Plant, Agnes Ferris, Senior Environmental Scientist at the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board, and also a member of the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, or BRIT, that was mentioned in Jen's talk, and Harriet Leigh Ross, Regulatory Director of the Bay Conservation and Development Commission. So we have this set up as a panel. If you go to the next slide. And we'll start with each of the panelists' opening remarks. And I think we have some slides queued up for them as well. So we've asked each of the panelists to share with us how their work intersects with nature-based solutions for shoreline resilience and what their agency or organization's role in NBS is. So we'll start with those opening remarks, and then you might recall from the registration that we crowdsourced some really good questions for the panelists when you guys signed up for the webinar. So after they do their opening remarks, we'll go to a facilitated discussion and then open it up to everyone for questions. But as I said, feel free to put comments or questions in the chat as we go along as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it over, I think, to Jackie first. I'm just going to make sure I see Agnes and Sam too. Okay, great. I'll hand it over to Jackie first for opening remarks.
Thank you, Heidi, and thanks to Jen and Sasha for the intros. This has been a really exciting project to be a part of, both the first mile and the regulatory pathways work that is intersecting with it. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the first mile horizontal levee project. And then, as Heidi said, we'll move on to the others and then questions. So what you're seeing on the screen is an image of what our project is. So we are located in right at the border of San Lorenzo and Hayward in the southern East Bay. And we are proposing a horizontal levee project at the back of what's known as Orloma Marsh. You can see up in the upper left corner of this diagram, the Orloma Sanitary District, and right where those letters are, you see some green. That is the Orloma Horizontal Levee Demonstration Project. And many of you on the line may be familiar with that. If you are not, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to give tours. But that was an effort with Orloma East Bay Dischargers Authority, which is the JPA through which Orloma and 5 other wastewater plants discharge their wastewater to the bay, and many other partners to demonstrate proof of concept for a horizontal levee. But what that demonstration doesn't do is connect to the bay. And so we came up with this concept of the first mile, and we call it that because it's approximately a mile in length, and we hope it will be one of the first horizontal levees implemented at scale. Sam's project that you'll hear about is ahead of ours, but this is a little bigger. So we conceived of this project largely as a test case for the regulatory challenges that we're talking about today. So we wanted to see, can we scale up this demonstration and connect it to the bay in a way that it can actually be permitted and feasible from a regulatory and a governance standpoint. Our project is a partnership that has multiple benefits and multiple beneficiaries. So for EBDA, as well as our members, Orloma and Castro Valley Sanitary Districts, the idea is to include a seepage slope for wastewater polishing that would remove nutrients and emerging contaminants. We also are hopeful that working with our partners at East Bay Regional Park District, which owns and manages most of the area that you're looking at, that we can increase public access and expand transitional and upland habitats for endangered species. Ultimately, the idea is to relocate the Bay Trail that you see on the western edge of your screen to where this horizontal levee is going to be as sea level rises and it gets more difficult to maintain the existing alignment. We are hoping that we'll be able to link to the San Lorenzo Community Park that you see in the eastern corner. So there's a lot of opportunity. Right now, this is an area that, other than the Bay Trail, is not accessible to the public. So we have a lot of potential opportunity. And also, this is part of a larger master plan to provide flood protection in the event of sea level rise to the San Lorenzo and Hayward communities. The biggest regulatory challenge that we have faced with this project is the fill issue that Jen talked about, and whether we can really mitigate our way around it. So this Orloma Marsh is a currently well-functioning marsh. It's not a degraded habitat necessarily that we are restoring as part of this project. We are saving it from its future self. And as was talked about, our regulations historically have not been well set up for that temporal difference of placing fill in something that's in good condition today in order to make it in better condition in the future and realize these other benefits. And so that's the tension that we've faced with this project. So we've had lots of consultations, early consultations with the Brit. I should say that the status of this project is that we just completed 30% design, and we're going to be releasing an RFP in the coming months to take the next phase of the design through 100% to get to something that's ready to build. So that's where we're at. We've developed 30% design in consultation with the Brit. And what we've found relative to our initial concepts is we've had to shrink the impact on the marsh in order to make this something that we can permit without requiring mitigation. And mitigation has two challenges for a project like this. One is just financially, this project, we're already not sure who's going to pay for it because the benefits are really diffuse among a lot of different stakeholders. And so we're not sure exactly how something like this can be financed. The work that's been done to date has been done via grants, and grants can't pay for mitigation generally. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is just a philosophical one, is especially from the wastewater community, when we're looking at traditional upgrades versus something like a nature-based multi-benefit project, there are a lot of risks and challenges associated with it, but wastewater agencies are engaging in this space because it feels like the right thing to do. It feels like a real opportunity to partner for broader benefits. And so when we're told that we have to mitigate for something that we're going out of our way to do as the right thing to do, there's sort of this disconnect of, we're not putting a Walmart on this marsh, we're doing something that's meant to improve the marsh. And so just working through that sort of philosophically has been a challenge for our community, I would say, moving into this space. And so the result is that we have this tension between the multiple benefits that we're trying to achieve. We're trying to protect the habitat that's there today, but that's meant shrinking the area for our seepage slope for the wastewater polishing. So even though one of the main goals of the water board and the wastewater community is to remove nutrients, and for that we need as much of a length as possible, instead of the first mile being available to treat, we're only treating wastewater through about 1/3 of a mile of the project length. And that really cuts down on the water quality benefit and the motivation of the wastewater partners like EBDA to really push this project forward. So that's been our biggest challenge. And I'll move to the next slide. So as I mentioned, there's, a potential conflict between multiple goals and benefits. I use my hands a lot in this illustration that, a horizontal levee kind of naturally goes out into an existing marsh. And the more that you push it back and try to minimize fill, all of a sudden now you're left with a seawall or, some a more traditional levee. And is that what we envision for flood protection around the bay? That's really kind of the trade-offs that we're looking at. The biggest opportunity that we've found is that we've made some really exciting progress working with the Brit on consideration of future conditions. I mentioned that our regulations generally aren't well set up for that temporal consideration, but we have gotten feedback from the Brit partners that we can look at what will wetlands look like in this area in 2080 with 1.8 feet of sea level rise, and take that into consideration. And so you see in the bottom left there a table that we developed looking at, there may be a net impact to 5.3 acres of under current conditions, but that shrinks to 1.9 acres when we're looking at future conditions when there's just more of this area underwater. So that's a real opportunity that we're looking to continue discussions with our regulatory partners on going forward. So I think I'll stop there and happy to answer questions as we move along.
Thank you so much, Jackie. So I think we'll move to Sam.
Great, thanks. So the city of Palo Alto is a community of about 70,000 people located in the mid-peninsula of the San Francisco Bay Area. Palo Alto has numerous policies in place that reflects the community's desire to maintain and improve the existing habitats along its bay edge. Similar to other cities in the area, Palo Alto has infrastructure that presents opportunities for implementation of NBS, and that includes a bay boundary, neighboring restoration efforts where connection points can be discussed and creatively decided upon. We also have a Baylands Nature Preserve that contains an extensive public access trail network, as well as our current flood control levees. Immediately behind those flood control levees and the Baylands Nature Preserve is additional city infrastructure, and that includes our golf course, Palo Alto Airport, the Regional Water Quality Control Plant, Bixby Park, which is a closed landfill, our flood basin, and our Municipal Services Center. Going back to the Regional Wastewater Treatment Plant, I do want to note that Palo Alto owns and operates that plant on behalf of other cities as well as Palo Alto. So that wastewater treatment plant serves about 230,000 people who live in Palo Alto, Mountain View, Los Altos Hills, Stanford University, and the East Palo Alto Sanitary District. So one example of a project that provides opportunities to implement NBS within Palo Alto is an upcoming Palo Alto improvement project for our flood control levees. That project is very large, both in terms of budget, scope, but also time. It's going to take a lot of time to coordinate with all of the other agencies that need to be involved in flood control levee projects. And it's going to take some time to figure out where those levees are going to go and all the other associated design elements. Some of those design elements can include NBS, such as horizontal levees. But before we go and design those, Palo Alto in particular wants to flesh out some of the unknowns still. And so Palo Alto has been working on what we call a permanent pilot. It's a pilot system that is going to stay for a very, very long time and eventually get incorporated into the larger improvement project of those levees. The pilot horizontal levee project is slated to be constructed in that red circled area shown there on this slide. It's going to use treated wastewater from the adjacent regional water quality control plant to irrigate the ecotone slope. And it's going to incorporate a few other things, such as public access trails and community science projects that are important to the city of Palo Alto. Some of the things that we're hoping to learn from this project include more information on costs, permitting, as well as design elements like plant pellet. Currently, the project, can we go ahead and go to the next slide, please? So this project has been a long-going partnership between the city of Palo Alto and the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. We've been fortunate enough to get grant funding from the Coastal Conservancy as well as the Environmental Protection Agency. So yay, thank you. The project has nearly completed design and we have obtained most of the permits needed to construct the project. So I've listed, excuse me. I've listed the permits that we've obtained so far on the slide. And sorry. And we are hoping to construct the project early next year. With that, I'll go ahead and pass it back to Heidi.
Sam, I think we have Agnes next.
Okay, thanks. Hi there. I'm gonna, as Heidi mentioned, I'm Agnes Ferris. I'm a senior environmental scientist at the Water Board. in the Watershed Division, and I'm also on the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, known as the BRIT. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Water Board's policies and permitting process for nature-based designs. But first, it's important to consider how our regulations came into being in the first place. As we all know, we've lost about 90% of our tidal marshes around the bay. This loss of habitat has impacted many species of plants, fish, and wildlife, leading to some of them becoming threatened or endangered. Our existing regulations came into being to protect these resources, and given the current development pressures today, are still relevant. The challenge for the regulatory agencies is being able to adapt quickly to address sea level rise while still protecting our natural resources from the ongoing threats that brought the regulations into being in the first place. The Water Board follows statewide policies established by State Board and regional policies set forth in the Water Quality Control Plan for the San Francisco Bay Basin, or Basin Plan for short. The two most relevant policies for regulating nature-based solutions are the state wetland definition and procedures for discharges of dredged or fill material to waters of the state, or procedures for short, and the California Wetlands Conservation Policy, commonly known as the No Net Loss Policy. The procedures requires projects to avoid and minimize impacts to aquatic habitat, then compensatory mitigation for unavoidable impacts. This often means placing the least amount of fill in aquatic habitat. The California Wetlands Conservation Policy calls for no net loss and the long-term net gain of wetland acres and functions. Next slide, please. So one challenge with nature-based solutions is that they often result in more fill placed in aquatic habitat compared to more traditional infrastructure, such as levees and seawalls. We can permit these nature-based solutions, though, under our existing regulations because we're considering nature-based designs as appropriate avoidance and minimization measures. So for example, even though a traditional levee will result in less fill placed in aquatic habitat, they don't provide the ecological benefits of nature-based designs, which can provide habitat, support natural physical processes, and are more resilient to sea level rise. So by incorporating nature-based solutions to avoid and minimize impacts, these types of projects can also have reduced compensatory mitigation requirements. And Jackie alluded to this earlier. So for example, we're not requiring compensatory mitigation for a fill that converts aquatic habitat to uplands if those fill areas are then converted back to waters within 30 to 50 years after project construction. So if you want to know more information on how the Water Board is thinking about permitting nature-based solutions and sea level rise adaptation projects, please take a look at our Climate Change Basin Plan Amendment. The Basin Plan Amendment does not change or add to our existing regulations, but it does provide useful information for projects that are planning and designing nature-based solutions. The amendment includes a lot of useful background information on climate change, and it poses a series of questions that are intended to help permit applicants develop projects that first avoid and minimize impacts, then compensate for impacts as required by our procedures and our no net loss policy. So I'll be happy to answer questions later if anyone wants to reach out. Thanks.
So much, Agnes. And our final panelist, Harriet Ross from BCDC.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Yes, again, I'm Harriet Ross, Regulatory Director at BCDC. I oversee our permitting program, dredging and sediment management, as well as our regulatory improvements team. So let's see, can you advance? I have some animation probably Yeah, there we go. So I want to start by describing a few key efforts over the past several years that led us to look very closely at our permitting program. So the first effort I'll highlight is a 2019 update to BCDC's San Francisco Bay Plan. This really set the policies that guide our entire permitting program. And the Bay Plan was first published in 1969 and had and still has a strong focus on limiting unnecessary filling of the bay. So while the Bay Plan always permitted filling for habitat creation and restoration projects, in 2019, we amended the Bay Plan to make this policy stronger and really to clarify the policy benefits and importance of allowing increased amounts of fill necessary for projects that restore and enhance the natural habitat. And then if you can advance, yeah, there we go. So the second effort I'll highlight, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, is the Bay Adapt Joint Platform that was published in 2021. BCDC's Bay Adapt program worked to create this regional resilience strategy alongside many stakeholders within the region. This strategy includes key actions for the region to respond to sea level rise. Interestingly, and I'm sure not surprising to this group, the stakeholders who contributed to the development of the joint platform identified that one of the significant challenges to actually getting adaptation projects built on time and on budget is the complex regulatory environment that we're all living in. So the joint platform laid out a vision for us, BCDC, and other permitting agencies, saying that rather than hold back projects, permitting should look to accelerate the resilient shoreline projects that align with those regional goals identified around resilience and around resilience projects that value ecosystems in particular. And then for the next, if you can advance my animation, there you go, thanks. The third effort I'll highlight is BCDC's 23-25 strategic plan. We built on that current critique of the regulatory environment we heard through the Bay Adapt Joint Platform when we created the current strategic plan. And that new strategic plan really outlines many efforts to better position ourselves to be ready to tackle the types of projects that will be at the core of the region's strategy for adapting to sea level rise. We're really challenging ourselves to be leaders in coordinating those regional strategies that focus on successful adaptation that puts natural and nature-based solutions first. It also directs us to integrate some of the long-range planning work I described with our day-to-day permitting functions. So the next slide. And so to meet these strategic plan goals that were laid out for us, with the help of funding from the State Coastal Conservancy, we created our Regulatory Improvements Unit, and we spent the last year doing an analysis of our permitting program, really looking at what has been working well and what we could improve upon. So we've created a work plan, a roadmap, a regulatory roadmap, we're calling it, that really outlines the steps we're going to be taking to make permitting work better for everyone involved, but really with a special focus on the projects that advance regional resilience and protect bay ecosystems. So the first goal in that roadmap is really to make our permitting process more effective, efficient, and transparent. We're really that's obvious. I think with any permitting program that's the ultimate goal. And we're really focusing on efforts to simplify our application requirements, modernize the tools and technology we use, and really to translate our program to make its requirements easier for everyone to understand. So if we're successful, hopefully we are, we'll be freeing up some headspace and work hours to really shift our focus to the second goal. And if you could hit the animation again. And really that is to build and enhance our capacity to implement the vision contained in the documents I discussed in the first slide, those three main guiding documents. So this will include evaluating whether our legislation gives us the authority to tackle the challenges rising sea levels are posing on the bay. We're looking for opportunities to work even more closely with our partners at other regulatory agencies. The BRIT is a great model for us. And really building a workforce with the size and expertise necessary to effectively and expeditiously review the work that major adaptation projects are likely to produce for our program. So we're beginning to hire, and we've made some hires to support that workforce. I think that's all that I had. Looking forward to the discussion and more questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that, yeah, thanks for taking the slides down. Great. Thank you so much for those opening remarks from the panel. So as I mentioned, we have some questions that we collected from you all when you signed up for the webinar. So we sort of sifted through those and compiled them into some questions that I'll give to the panelists now, and then we'll open it up if there's additional follow-up questions. So I'm just going to dive right into it. Really appreciate those opening remarks. The first question, Harriet and Agnes sort of touched on this from some of the recent advances within your own agencies. And moving back to Sam and Jackie on this, I'm sort of curious how they're seeing those play out on the ground on the projects that they're working on. So I'm going to start with this question for Sam, and then we can sort of open it up from there. I was curious, based on your experiences and sort of what we've talked about today, what stands out to you as some of the promising advances in regulatory pathways that you've seen as you've been moving these projects forward? And you both touched on that a little bit in your opening remarks, but any way that you'd like to expand on that. And then Agnes and Harriet, if you'd like to add anything to what you highlighted, we can open it up as to that as well. But we'll start with Sam.
Great. Yeah, so I think one of the promising advances is just the feeling of clear support from all of the resource agencies that has been expressed in not only streamlining where and when possible permit conditions, but also helping to figure out how best to apply and approach these projects. So I think that's also evident in not only the BRIT and the coordination that occurs there, but also in streamlining efforts like the programmatic biological opinion. So getting not only that support at a high level, but also having that translate into actionable items has been very helpful and very promising for the horizontal levee pilot project that we're working on in particular, and I think other nature-based solutions.
Thank you.
Me next. Yeah, I think what I highlighted and Agnes highlighted as well, the ability to consider future conditions, I think is really promising and is going to be really helpful for the First Mile project. And I would say, beyond that, just the real engagement from the BRIT. I mean, our project is pretty early in its development. We're not at the stage of applying for permits yet. And so the ability to work with the BRIT to understand what the issues are going to be, to frame our designs around that, to have, they invited us to sit in a room and lay out a map and really brainstorm, how we can better optimize this project and the regulatory needs. And so that process and that opportunity has been really valuable.
And just to kind of jump in and echo that's what I was going to say is sort of these emerging forums or these integrated regulatory agency meetings to really work through something specific and how to get it done and where everyone sits and how they view a particular project or permit and what they're going to be requiring. I think all that working together, this interagency coordination is really key to getting things done more quickly and to be coordinated.
And I'll go ahead and chime in here. I guess I want to echo what everyone else is saying. Improving coordination and communication between the restoration community and the agencies, it is really helping a lot. On the one hand, the regulatory agencies need to better understand the restoration project's perspective, all the different constraints they're dealing with. And then as we're working together, the agencies can help projects better understand our requirements and sort of navigate the permitting process. And for those who aren't familiar with the BRIT, the idea behind that is you consult with a team of 6 staff from all the different agencies, state and federal, well before you develop, 65% plans and designs, and we help identify additional information we need or any sort of issues that we see coming down the road, so we can talk those things through. And I think Jackie was mentioning earlier that it can be hard to identify funds for mitigation, but if you incorporate your mitigation, right, your offset as part of your project design, that opens up pots of money that would not normally be available for a mitigation project. So working those details out early with the agencies is really important.
Great. And just sort of following up to that, and because, we have in the audience a really good mix of, we have some consultants, we have folks from local government here, as well as regulators. So folks that might be working on projects themselves on the ground. So I also wanted to ask sort of what some of the lessons you've learned, either for Jackie and Sam, as you've been through this process, anything that you'd, mistakes, course corrections, or, things that you thought were particularly efficient in your process that you would convey as a best practice. And similarly for Agnes and Harriet, I would sort of frame that as, as you've been through these projects and have been working with more project components on them, what are some ideal ways that you'd like these projects brought to you, or that you've learned through these, first few years of the BRIT that you would convey to others that might be developing projects or are thinking about developing projects? So since Jackie is in the midst of all of this with the first mile horizontal levee, we'll start with her on this question.
Yeah, and I would say since we're in the midst of it, I don't have very many lessons learned yet because we're learning as we go. I think, I would just reiterate the early consultation, the ability to get some feedback when you're at the very conceptual stage, then you don't get too far along in a design that ultimately is not optimized for what the regulations are going to expect. So that that's been useful, but I don't have any real broad lessons learned quite yet. I'm going to learn from Sam.
We'll check back with you in a couple years.
Yeah.
Sam?
So I'll go ahead and jump on in after that. So I think one of the big lessons learned is that resource agencies and permitting agencies aren't the only stakeholders that need to be engaged early and often in the project. There's a lot of community interest and support in NBS, but I would also say that not everybody clearly supports it, if that makes sense. And so educating the public and getting feedback from your community is just as important to do early on in a project as consulting with resource agencies. I think the other lesson learned is to be prepared and budget for some extensive post-construction monitoring. So I don't know about everybody who is planning for NBS, but some of those engineers or some of those project managers may be new to restoration projects or NBS, like me. I am new to that. I'm used to doing a project that's within a fence line of a wastewater treatment plant. So for me, learning of this post-construction monitoring that is required for a nature-based solution or similar restoration project was a bit of a surprise for me that I also did not budget for. So that was a very big lesson learned that I'm currently navigating now to line up additional funds before we actually construct the project. So I think those are the two big lesson learns that I have at this point.
Great, thanks. Agnes and Harriet, you want to add anything before we move on to the next question?
Sure, I can go first. I guess lesson learned is we still have a lot to learn about how to design and permit nature-based solutions. There's a whole suite of nature-based designs besides horizontal levees. There's artificial reefs, coarse beaches, ecotone levees, just reconnecting our creeks to our baylands. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to any of them. So it's really important to think about your landscape setting and your constraints and implement the right solution in the right place. So for example, we're working with the San Francisco Joint Powers Authority on the Safer Bay project, and they did a study that evaluating their proposed ecotone slope. And their study concluded that constructing a broad transition zone to provide habitat and marsh transgression space didn't provide sufficient value to offset the immediate loss of high quality marsh. And so the project is now revising their design to construct a narrower transition zone where there is existing high quality marsh. So, we're finding different constraints for the same type of solution depending on your ecological setting.
Okay,
You want to add anything?
Yeah, I've only been with BCDC for just under a year, so I wasn't really part of the permitting process, but I did get some good notes and feedback from the team. And I think, there's a number of lessons learned. I think one of the things was that specific to this project is that levees really should be set back into the upland areas as much as possible. And rather than building out the levee into the existing bay or tidal marsh, due to the adverse impacts of the wildlife and habitat, at least in the short term, and understanding there's a long-term goal here. So really, rather than building out these levees into these existing resources, really waiting until the tidal marsh can reestablish at the site with sea level rise in the future, and really considering, the future considerations as we already talked about. And in areas where levees can impact the existing bay habitats, the levees should be sloped appropriately to minimize impacts to habitat in the near term, while providing area for marsh migration in the future. Understand that's probably, frustrating when you're trying to build something for the long term is better. But there are these short-term construction impacts that we have to consider, that we're bound by our laws and policies to consider. And then the only other thing I would mention, we have a set of environmental justice policies at BCDC, and I think that's often in a lot of the permitting projects. Just it's a consideration. We ask for meaningful engagement. What does the existing community want? What do they see? Have you consulted with them, and what is the feedback you've heard? So those are kind of just a couple things I would add to the discussion.
That's great. Thank you so much. We have a question in the chat from Brian Leslie, who wrote, how would you recommend that other regions approach these NBS regulatory challenges, specifically the ones brought up around horizontal levees? Do you review the BRIT as a key step for other regions to implement? And I will highlight the BRIT is really something that, I know of a couple of examples around the US, but not many. So it is like a really unique forum that has been very value added, as folks have talked about here. So would anybody like to tackle this question, thinking about folks that are on the webinar, maybe not in the Bay, that are interested in these projects in other regions of California or the US, and how you would recommend approaching these projects?
Well, in the absence of BRIT, I would recommend, which I know it sounds a little bit of a broken record here since we've talked about this, is early consultation with all the regulatory agencies that you need permits from. I mean, that's the easiest and best way to really get these types of projects, so you can anticipate what they're going to ask for. And maybe that's especially important, and why I'm bringing it up, because BCDC is basically the last permit that you receive. So we get a lot of projects that have already gotten all their discretionary approvals, and they come to us and they're surprised that they need to provide public access or do other things to get their project permitted. And they are at 60% design. So it's frustrating for them. So all I can advocate for is early consultation.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yes, my name is Joe Wagner. I'm a consulting engineer, and there's large-scale beneficial reuse projects or large-scale environmental restoration projects. The key is to try to get everybody in the room that has a perspective on this early and try to find those pain points and concession points and draw out a large objective. I'm going to drop into the chat a website to one of the projects they've done in Cleveland, where they're looking at over 30 years of dredge material that has been banned from being placed in the lake, which is now being placed in the lake because of the beneficial uses it'll bring, all the way from infrastructure protection to restoration of really sparse habitat areas that are disappearing quickly in the lake, very similar to what you see in San Francisco.
That's great. We love examples from other parts of the country. So thank you for sharing that in the chat. And definitely use of dredge materials is of great interest to many of our projects in the Bay as well. So that's a great example, and thanks for sharing it. I'm going to move on to another question that came in with registrations. And it's sort of about what's next. What are some of the key levers that your agency or organization are focusing on to make big changes for regulatory pathways? So this is maybe a question more for Agnes and Harriet, but Sam and Jackie, feel free to chime in. And I thought we'd start with Agnes on this question. If you could touch on what you see as next steps for the BRIT and, some of the work that you guys are sort of taking on in the coming years on this topic.
Sure. Yeah, so I think it was briefly mentioned earlier, but I don't know if everyone's familiar with how the BRIT works. So there's a group of 6 of us from the state and federal agencies, and then we coordinate with the PMC, the Policy Management Committee, which is a group of our managers. And the PMC has been tasked with addressing a list of issues that have come up that have been identified as like sticking points, right, for these types of projects. And it's called a Permit and Policy Improvement List. You can find it on our website. And with every year, the BRIT produces an annual report, and it's attached to that. So we're making progress on these different issues that have been identified as sticking points. Some of that, for example, we're making progress on finding a permitting pathway for artificial reefs in the San Francisco Bay Area. That's something that has been difficult for CDFW to support and permit. And so there's been delays with permitting artificial reefs, but we're developing a permitting framework that all the agencies can agree to, and that'll be finalized hopefully in the next year or two. The other thing that we've been making progress on is improved coordination with other entities that don't normally come to any of these pre-application meetings and are not necessarily part of planning and design for restoration projects. So for a lot of our shoreline restoration projects, there's existing infrastructure like pipelines, PG&E towers, railroads. Those can be an obstacle because often our projects have to design around them or avoid impacts to them. Or what we're seeing quite often is they come in late in the game and delay permitting because an issue comes up, like protecting an existing PG&E tower. So we're working on developing more relationships with these entities so that they are becoming more involved earlier in discussions. So we're not we're not having delays later in permitting. So for example, we have a point of contact now at PG&E and they can identify, who is the planning lead for this particular project. They can red flag, these are Brit restoration projects we need to keep an eye on, and we need to make sure that we're coordinating with them. And so hopefully we can develop those same working relationships with other entities, especially the railroad. I would really like to get the railroad, part of discussions.
I was going to ask you, Agnes, does that mean you have a point of contact for the railroad?
Not yet.
One of the challenges, or Harriet identified that we should be backing up the our nature-based solutions as far as we can out of the existing marsh. And one of the big constraints on the first mile project is that there's a railroad corridor right behind us, so we're kind of hemmed in. So yeah, that's great to hear that the water board is working on that. To Heidi's question, since I have the mic, I'll just mention one other thing, which is that we're excited about the idea of having a larger geographic look at permitting. I know that's something that we talked about in the regulatory pathways project, and that the BRIT and the PMC are looking at like the organization operational landscape unit, OLU scale. The first mile project is part of a master plan that covers a larger swath of the Hayward shoreline, and we are going to be in parallel with moving the first mile design forward, working on an implementation plan for those projects in coordination with each other as part of the master plan, and thinking about how do we do permitting in a way that kind of balances the net loss and net improvement of wetlands and habitats on that scale. So that's another area I think is promising, that's been talked about, that we're going to hopefully take advantage of.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Lucas has had their hand up for a while, so I will pass it over to you, Lucas.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you, everyone. Very interesting discussion. I think this is an important issue, especially for the future. I wanted to follow up on some points that were made by Jackie and Agnes about the First Mile Horizontal Levee project. I am also very interested in how the Section 404 and Section 401 permitting process can change to accommodate these projects, and I heard some indication that is happening slightly, and so I want to understand more about that. Maybe it'll be discussed in the white paper that was discussed earlier. I look forward to reading that, but I want to hear more about how we take into account future conditions, how we can, considering the historic planning timeframe for the Section 401 permit processes, on 5 to 10 year timeframe, when we're thinking about sea level rises more on the order of 50 years, and considering habitat type conversions that will occur if we just leave the current marsh to its current condition. It'll just become open water. I want to better understand how the regional board's climate change basin plan amendment is modifying the standard Section 404 permitting process with respect to compensatory mitigation. Just to understand a little bit more about how that's being taken into account, specifically with the First Mile project, since those discussions have been going on.
You want to start, Agnes?
Sure. So to be clear, the climate change basin plan amendment does not change any of our regulations. So basically, it's incorporating climate change into our basin plan so that we can consider it, and it increases our flexibility when we're interpreting our regulations. So for the First Mile levee, typically, if we went through the 404B1 alternatives analysis, it would identify a traditional levee as the least damaging practicable alternative, because it would, result in the least amount of fill, place, and aquatic habitat. But that is not what we want to do here. And so we're considering a nature-based design at the First Mile levee as an avoidance and minimization measure, right? So the project is avoiding and minimizing impacts by constructing a nature-based solution that'll provide habitat, and it'll provide some marsh transgression space, although that's limited because of the railroad, and it's more resilient to sea level rise. And so, you know, from that lens, we can say that the horizontal levee is the least damaging practicable alternative, not the traditional levee. And so because this project is using a nature-based design, we can reduce their mitigation requirements. So Jackie showed that little table in her slides. You know, so we're looking ahead at 30 to 50 years post-project construction. Some of those fill areas where they're going to place fill and convert wetlands to uplands will be converted back to waters. And so we're not going to ask for compensatory mitigation for those areas that will become waters within 50 years of the project construction. So
that's helpful. Thank you. What about the mitigation ratios, for example? You know, typically used to seeing mitigation ratios like 2 or 3, but for projects that have nature-based solutions, I would assume that we should have lower mitigation ratios.
Well, so, you know, I want to be clear that we don't have set mitigation ratios, right? So it's always on a case-by-case basis.
Right.
Yeah, and so there's always like a minimum starting point, and because of our no net loss policy, that minimum starting point is always 1-to-1, 1 acre of, you know, of mitigation for each acre lost, and so that's our minimum starting point based on the no net loss policy.
Okay. That helps. Yeah. Is this discussed in the white paper? I think that, you know, maybe what might be coming to consider, I know we don't want to necessarily change, you know, try to amend the Clean Water Act or the 404 permitting process, but maybe that's something that should be considered because these categories of projects are different than development projects and maybe should have some streamlining or some, you know, different criteria applied to them that's different than a normal development project.
If I may, this is Jennifer C. I'm going to jump in and say that, Lucas, yes, we are looking at programmatic permitting with the Corps of Engineers to assess that very thing that you're talking about. We really, opening up the Clean Water Act is kind of a non-starter. It's there's
Right.
no
Just hypothetically.
Yeah, but as I mentioned, there's lots of flexibility in how we are interpreting our regulations as they're written, and therefore that's, you know, the each core district has that possibility to take the regulatory flexibility and apply it into a programmatic permit specifically for nature-based solutions. So that is something that we are looking at now in concert with them. More to follow.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for adding that, Jen, and great question. So I want to make sure we end on time. So I think we will wrap it up, the panel now, and just thank you all very much for your really excellent comments and just all of these forums where we can have these, you know, cross-cutting conversations and advance these projects. So thank you all very, very much. I'm going to hand it back over to Sasha to wrap us up, and yeah, thanks.
All right, thanks Heidi, and thank you so much to all of our panelists and Jen, to you for your presentation along with Heidi. It was really great to hear from all of you, and thank you to everybody who attended today. I have a short poll that I want to do. We're planning the rest of the Transforming Shorelines Collaborative engagements, events for the coming years, and I'm interested to hear from you whether you like these shorter webinars, this is our first time doing something like this, or whether you prefer kind of the longer, more in-depth, in-person, interactive workshops that we've had in the past. So I will launch a poll here. Please take a moment to fill it out. What format for Transforming Shorelines Collaborative meetings works best for you? I'm seeing the poll responses come in. Thank you. Looks like about half of you have responded. If you haven't, take a moment to fill out the poll. Okay, great. I will end the poll and show you for the people who have responded. It looks like many of you like both the virtual webinars and in-person meetings. Some people prefer virtual webinars, which is feedback we learned before, which is why we're trying it. So thank you. This is really helpful. You can expect going forward that we will have a mix of both the virtual meetings and longer in-person meetings. Coming up this year, we're expecting to have one about the operations and maintenance of horizontal levees, the lessons learned about that from the Orloma pilot project. We'll also have one around community engagement and nature-based solutions with a focus on North Richmond. So please get onto the mailing list if you're interested in finding out about our events. We won't spam you. We'll just tell you about upcoming things a few times a year. And yes, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. See you later.
Have a good day.
Thanks.